Here is a turquoise ink by Sailor Studio 341. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. By putting out so many inks in such a short amount of time, Sailor kind of hurt themselves. There are bound to be some real losers with that many inks, and there's bound to be some real winners that are missed because there's just so many to choose from. This is one of those that gets missed. A great turquoise by Sailor that is lost by the huge quantity they put out all at once. A very nice turquoise that has a tiny bit of tone variation by pen, but does show plenty of shading effectively. So check this one out if you like turquoise, because you won't be disappointed. The pen for today is a Noodler's Nib Creeper. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get here, and it is by far not too light to use at all. We have no feathering and we have no spread. We do get some very nice shading. Look at peered, the very first word, first line. The P is darker than the E's and the R, and the E gets very dark again, lightening up into the D, but becoming very dark at the D. Into, on the second line, the N is lighter than the T, which is very dark, and the O lightens up quite a bit. And we see a lot of shading very much like this through all of the extra fine writing. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we had with the extra fine. We still have no feathering and no spreading. We still have pretty good shading going on. And, you know, you could point out people on the first line where there's a tiny bit of shading, but not a ton, where there right next to it shows much better shading, where the T is lighter than the H, which is pretty dark. It lightens up into the ear at the end, sitting there without a problem. On sitting, third line, the SI is much lighter than the TT, and then it lightens up on the IN, darkening again at the G. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, with no feathering and with no spread. It does shade, I think, a little bit better than it did with the medium. Look at there was on the first line. The TH is darker than the ER, and the last E is very dark in and of itself. Was, the beginning of the W is lighter than the end of the W. It starts to darken up a bit. Now, during the A, it transitions from a darker to a lighter tone again into the S, but the downstroke of that S does become dark again. Mitts on the second line. Starts nice and light on the MI, beginning of the D. During the D, it darkens. S, it lightens. T, it darkens again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as we had on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering and with no spread. We do get a little bit of shading, and it's about like what we had on the Clairfontaine. There were moments that could have been better, sure. Look at there were on the second line, where the T is a little bit lighter than the HE. The beginning of the Y certainly is very light, and then darkening at the downstroke of that Y. Drinking in that shading with drinking on the third line, where the D is a nice mid-tone, the RIN lighten up, and the king at the end does get darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering and with no spread. That without shading, it would look good, but look at that without on the third line. A very nice shading going on. The T is a nice mid-tone, the H very dark, the A quite light, the T very dark again. Without starts light on the with. Most of out stays fairly light, but the H is actually a little bit darker than the letters around it, and the T at the end is much darker than the entire word. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with very nice shading without a doubt. Take a look at them, got up, and the whole second line, really. You see them starts lighter, gets darker at the H, darkens on the EM, except at the end of the M where it starts to get darker again. Got the G starts lighter at the top, but it gets darker down at the bottom. Light into the O, dark into the T, where up starts dark on the U, gets light in the U, dark again at the P. It's shading so well here. It's amazing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. I want to say it becomes a bit more green leaning, though not bad. I think it looks very nice on this paper. No feathering, no spread. There is some shading going on. Look at idea of begging. First line, idea is quite a bit darker than of right next to it. Begging lightens up quite a bit. Now, we're not seeing a huge amount of shading throughout individual words, though we can find some. I think the tone on this paper is really the thing speaking to me here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, still quite a bit more green leaning than it was with no feathering and with no spread. There is some shading. Again, it's there. It's not a standout quality in and of itself. You see it a lot in the word glittering on the third line, but not a lot and huge standout in other areas. It's really the tone that is looking its best here. It's nice. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading that is definitely standing out here. Look at lightless dark. First words, first line. Lightless really does a lot of tone shifting where the L is very dark. It lightens up at the I. During the GH, it starts to gain some darkness. Out of the H into the T, it's light, but at the TL, it's very dark, and the S at the end, much lighter until the last S, downstroke, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine with no feathering, with no spread, with very little shading, less shading than we had on the Clairfontaine. Yes, you can find some areas, like if you look at in the gloom on the first line, in is certainly darker than the, and the is certainly darker than gloom. So there's some shading differences going on word to word there. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do see some shading going on in the forest of turquoise that's going on here. Had to fit that in. Is fairly dark. The right next to it starts lighter on the T, darkens on the up and down stroke of the H, but it's the hump of the H that lightens up, where the E gets very dark again. Now, forest, the F is a little bit darker than the Oris, but the T at the end becomes pretty dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading just as well as it was on the Clairfontaine. By that time, we talk about shading. By that time on the first line, where look at how much tone shift there is just in the word by, just in the letter B. Look at that right next to it, how the top of the T is lighter than the bottom of the T, where the top of the H is darker than the bottom of the H. It's so much going on. It really would be almost wasting time to go over all of it. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no surprise.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Aurora Borealis. Here is Kaweco Paradise Blue. Here is Pilot Soyo, or Dew on Pine Tree. Here is Sailor Kobe number 44. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter, duller, and less interesting than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not a whole lot lighter, not a whole lot duller, but definitely much less interesting. There's still no feathering and there is still no spread. There is still shading. Look at Lost at Light. Words. Lost, comma, at least on the first line. Where lost, the bottom of the L is darker than the top of the L, and O transitions from darker to lighter, which it keeps in the S, and the T gets much darker. Where at, 2 letters, 2 tone, absolutely beautiful. Least starts darker on the LEA, but the S lightens up and the T becomes darker than the beginning of the word. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get better shading than we had with the extra fine here, but they had a wider nib to work with. Look at but they had on the third line, where but at the top of the B, it's lighter than the bottom of the B. The bottom of the but is generally a bit darker. Now, looking at the U, it transitions from a darker to lighter tone during the U, but the T does get darker again. They is mostly a lighter tone except the H, which is quite a bit darker, and had goes from a darker H to a lighter A into a darker end of the D. I'm not making an end of the D joke. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading going on. That's not too bad. Look at Getting Drowsy on the first line, where the G is darker than the E, the 2 T's darken up quite a bit, the IN become light, the G very dark. Drowsy is not a sleepy word at all, as the D is darker than the ROW, but it's during the end of the S that it starts to darken up a little bit, lightening up again into the Y, but as it's light into the Y, it darkens up during the Y. Looking at the back of the page, so nice, with no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Elixir Siloso Sunset. Here is a purple ink by Diamine Lilac Satin. Here is a black ink by Lamy Black. Here is a red ink by Delta Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering and we do get some spread. I don't like what I'm seeing, especially with the way they just seem to come together. They're a little bit more distracting than some of the times where I say it's not so bad. I'm looking at more than ever on the first line, or it jumped on the third. Doesn't mean that this is the end of the world. I will say there's some shading going on here that does look okay, but I just think you're losing out on what is best with this ink, using it on 20-pound toilet paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering. There is spread. Neither of those are actually as bad as I thought they were on the Clairfontaine. Here, I think it's a little bit better, a bit better under control. Can't really say why that's happening, just the way it looks. Now, there's some shading going on. Look at lights and they on the first line, where lights is darker, except the GH is certainly a little bit lighter than what's around it, and is a nice lighter tone, where they mostly is dark, except the beginning of the Y, which is quite a bit lighter. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Yes, it has some moments of shading, which it's just touching up front a little bit. Take a look at touching, where you see the T is a little bit darker than most of the word. The H darkens just a little bit compared to what's around it. The G is certainly darker than the rest of the word, even front on the second line, where the F is darker than the RON, and the T very dark. Looking at the back of the page, now I can tell that it's getting pretty deep into the paper. On camera, I'm hoping it fully comes through. I personally wouldn't write on the back of this page, though I guess you could if you really wanted to, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is only slightly the lightest tone, and it does shade fairly well, even from a dry extra fine pen. The medium and the stub perform exactly the same and are darker than the extra fine with better shading. The only distinguishing really between the medium and the stub is, of course, the line variation that you would expect of the stub. Now, the wider range of the thickened naturalness that comes with that stub has it look better to me, so I would have that as my choice. But really, just ink your favorite pen and enjoy. Ink, enjoy, repeat.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if you're not subscribed, I would invite you to do so now.